Hey guys, let's get into our last topic in the neuroscience series, and that is brain anatomy. So, we've talked about all the things except the brain, the almighty brain. This is yours truly, right here. Um, I'm holding a brain. These are more brains here. These are my brain buddies. Um, so let's kind of look at a couple cool facts about the brain and see if you can guess or deduce whether or not they are true or false. Okay, so we use only 10% of our brain, true or false? Think about these for a second and I will come back to them. The brain itself feels pain, true or false? Brains float, true or false? How big are brains? Well, I kind of gave it away with this little picture here, right? Kind of the size of maybe like a small to medium roast, as morbid as that sounds. Um, that's about how I can describe them. So let's go back through our little list of true or falses here and see what we know. So we use only 10% of our brain, true or false? This is false. This is very false. Um, so when you think about the composition of the brain, it's not necessarily all neurons, right? It's not all the kinds of neurons that you think it is, right? So it's not all neurons responsible for either language, vision, audition, memory, right? So you have neurons in there that are they're support cells. You have oligodendrocytes. They form like a framework that other neurons can kind of attach themselves to. You've got your Schwann cells that make up the myelin that wraps up a lot of your brain matter, right? There are blood vessels. There are vesicles with cerebrospinal fluid. That mass isn't just a mass of neurons involved directly in cognition. So if you think about maybe how much of that mass is newly developed cortex, you might be able to say that that accounts for 10% of the brain matter. But otherwise, this little statement right here, this perpetuated myth, is truly a myth. Okay, so the brain itself feels pain, true or false? You remember when we were talking about single unit controlled stimulation, right? So you stimulate different parts of the brain in an epileptic patient in sort of open brain surgery to you're kind of feeling around for the problem areas that are causing the epilepsy. And historically, while this was being done, it was discovered that we have the sensory motor cortex. Sorry, we have the primary sensory cortex, we have the primary motor cortex, and stimulating areas within these particular cortexes will cause either the percept in a particular area, cause a percept in a particular area of the body, or cause motion, some kind of action in a particular area of the body. And no, you don't feel pain when people are poking around in there. So, when you get past the scalp and the skull, those are the painful parts. You can wake a patient up and continue on with your brain surgery. Excuse that interruption. Okay, so true or false, brains float? Well, it's true for the most part, right? So your brain is kind of sort of suspended in its own little puddle of cerebrospinal fluid in your skull. And yeah, this is kind of the reason for when we see traumatic brain injuries a lot of times. If you were to get hit in the head in one direction, so you get hit in the left side of the head, your brain actually, sort of swishes over to the right side of your head. So you get contralateral damage, right? You have damage on the left side and damage on the right side from the fact that your brain is moving around as a tennis ball would do in water, kind of, or suspended in water. Okay. I don't think you could actually suspend a tennis ball in water. It would probably float. But you know what I'm saying. I'm sure you're getting this visualization. All right. So, cool facts about the brain. This little guy right here is called the Brain. He's a character on a pretty fantastic show called Pinky and the Brain. And if you haven't watched it, you should. Okay, bye. All right, so let's look a little bit at our cross species comparisons. So, when we look at the human brain as compared to other animal brains, you can see things, differences like how big the cerebral cortex is in humans compared to animals. So, we're looking at these cerebral hemispheres, right? So, all of this here is cortex, and oh, look, none of these guys have it. Now, granted, these aren't mammals, okay? So, mammalian brains are going to look a lot, they will be more similar to the human brain, but these are interesting comparisons, okay? So, if you look at the olfactory area, olfactory meaning smell, right? So, look at the olfactory area. We may have a lot more cortex, but we certainly don't have a lot of olfactory cortex dedicated to smell in our environment. Why? And it's probably because if you're gonna lose a sense, smell is probably the best one to lose. Not that losing any particular sense is good, but if you had to pick one to throw out the door, it would smell would probably be the safest one. All right. I'm sorry, I should finish my thought there. So the idea is that, um, evolutionarily speaking, we didn't need smell as much in our environment as the bird, as the frog, as even the fish, right? Comparatively speaking, if you look at the size of this olfactory bulb as compared to the rest of their brain components, we ended up not needing smell as much. We have vision, we have audition, we have, pretty good vision, and that is primarily what we use to avoid predators, and hunt prey and forage for food, basically survive. Okay, now we can move on. So these are some mammalian brains as compared to humans, and not just drawings. These are a little bit more realistic depictions, right? So you have these are actual. This one maybe not an actual picture. This looks more like a scan or a rendition. But here's an elephant brain compared to a human's. Check out it looks like they've got sort of this whole cerebellum, forebrain, hindbrain. We'll get to that in a little bit thing going on. Look at the gorilla. Seems to be a little bit more smooth, like less, the hills aren't as rounded. Here, these hills aren't as rounded here. But very similar in size and structure to the human brain. Dolphins, lots of brain going on here, and it's no surprise with dolphins and elephants, right? Well, elephants are big, so you would expect them to have a big brain, but it also looks very developed, cortically developed. Okay, and here as well with the dolphins. Okay, and it's not surprising. Dolphins have their own like spoken language, if you will, which is very impressive. Elephants mourn their dead. They congregate in communities, and they socialize very much like humans sort of socialize. So all of these similarities here between mammalian brains, and check out our cat, dog, the macaque. And the macaque is here because these are the brains that are used a lot in scientific research. And the mice brains are also used a lot in scientific research. The mouse hippocampus is one that you see a lot in the research being sort of used for preliminary tests to make assumptions about what's going on with human memory. Okay, and then of course our friend Homer. So let's talk about the brain and how it's divided up. Okay, firstly, we'll sort of go from the bigger divisions to the smaller divisions. So we'll talk about the hemispheres first. You've got two hemispheres, right? And the hemispheres are responsible for what we refer to as contralateral function. Contralateral, contra meaning against, right? Or opposite, lateral meaning side, essentially. So the left side of your brain, so these are the eyes here. The left side of your brain is going to take care of the right side of your body, and the right side of your brain is going to take care of the left side of your body. Similarly, right visual field information is going to come into the left hemisphere, and left visual field information will come into the right. Notice it's visual field. It does not mean that all the information from the right eye goes to the left hemisphere. We'll talk about that more when we get into vision. We also have a little bit of lateralization of function going on between our hemispheres. So it is not the case that certain functions are specific to certain hemispheres. So and we'll talk about this a little bit more when we talk about the hemispheres, because we'll get into those in more detail. But there are some tasks that are kind of lateralized, right? So Broca and Wernicke's area are responsible for speech, production, and comprehension, respectively. And those are located on the left side of your brain. Okay, they're in the left anterior frontal and left temporal lobes. So those are really responsible for speech and language. And those are mainly on the left side of the brain. That's not to say that the right side of the brain doesn't have anything to do with language, because the right side of the brain tends to be involved with things like prosody and intonation. So you can see some lateralization, but there's really no rule that says that a particular function has to be taken care of by one hemisphere or another, which is really great for us, because that means that when a particular area of the brain is damaged, the corresponding area of the brain on the other side can hopefully maybe make up for some of that damage. Okay, now how do the hemispheres communicate with one another? They do that through the corpus callosum. And yes, you can have a severed corpus callosum, which results in a split brain patient. We'll have a lot more on that later, again, when we talk about hemispheres. But the corpus callosum is essentially a whole bunch of myelinated, we know it's myelinated because it's all white, a whole bunch of myelinated nerves that are crossing back and forth between the hemispheres. Okay, about 200 million projections last time I checked, and it compares comparable structures on either side. So we won't do this link yet, because we'll get to that in the hemispheres video series. Okay, so we've done the two major divisions, the two big divisions of the brain. Now let's look at the four smaller divisions of the brain, and these are the four lobes. And you probably already know them. We'll just do a quick overview for those that don't. All right, so our first lobe is our frontal lobe, right? And frontal lobe is all about, it really sets us apart as a species, really. It's about higher cognition, memory, motor, movement, abstract thinking. We do like planning, memory retrieval can happen here, judgment, working memory, which is the memory that you use as you were doing a task, right? You have to hold things in memory when you're doing a task. Executive functioning, that's things like decision making and planning, like all that stuff is sort of included into executive function. So our frontal lobes are pretty important to functioning as we do as a species, to the level of functioning that we have as a species, we can pretty much attribute to our frontal lobes. All right. number two. Lobe number two. Take a guess of what it is. It's the parietal lobe. So the parietal lobe is all about somatosensory input and spatial information, right? We have two routes for vision, we have two routes for audition, and spatial information is always sent up to the parietal lobe. Okay, the where information is sent up to the parietal lobe. So in the parietal lobe, you have these association area. You have a somatosensory association area, right? You've got your somatosensory cortex. What is an association area? So the example I used before about the what and the where pathways. So if you're looking at a picture of an apple and you're trying to name, the object in the picture, you have to match visual input to what it is that you know linguistically, right? So you have to match information coming in here to information that you have stored here. So we're going to have to link this information up somewhere, and a lot of times it's up here. Okay? All right. The occipital lobe is all about vision. Vision. That's all it does. Vision. Anything to do with vision. Vision. Now, there are other parts of the brain that do take part in visual processes as well. Okay, but the visual cortex, the occipital lobe, does not do anything other than vision. Okay. If that tells you anything about how important vision is to us as a species, it should. So, right. Okay. I will probably emphasize it 1,000 times more when we talk about vision. So I don't want to sound like a broken record just yet. So our temporal lobes, hearing, language, object recognition. Right, so primary auditory cortex you've got primary auditory cortex strip sort of right around here. Okay, and that information gets associated with other information right around here. Language, you have Wernicke's area, which is right around here. There is some language. Broca's area is going to be right around this area where it says speech. Okay, but we generally think of language as being mostly taken care of in the temporal lobe. All right. Let's check out some directions and planes in the human body. I'm just going to point out a couple of more important ones that you'll read them in scientific papers. You'll see them in, if you're going into the medical field, this is just terminology that's used a lot in any kind of anything to do with the human body. Okay, so proximal is going to be toward the head. Distal is going to be toward the feet or toward the end of the limb. So proximal is going to be toward the trunk of the body here on the arm, right? And distal will be out towards the fingertips. Medial will be toward the middle, and lateral is going to be out to the side. So the pelvis is medial to the arm, and the arm is lateral to the pelvis. Make sense? Okay. Anterior is going toward the front of the body. Posterior is going toward the back of the body. Now, when you get into the brain, things change a little bit with the anterior, posterior, inferior, superior, it's a lot of stuff. Okay, so when you get into directions and planes in the brain, these are sort of the main ones you're going to want to know. Dorsal is superior. Ventral is inferior. So let's go back to, see this, superior, inferior. Okay, when you're talking about the body, superior is up, inferior is down. When you're talking about the brain, we refer to up as dorsal and down as ventral. Now, this gets confusing because look, but dorsal is this way. What? Okay, so imagine evolutionarily speaking, that we have, forgive me, I'm going to draw. And I know that my drawings leave much to be desired. But okay, so you imagine, here's our stick person guy, right? Hey, what's up? Imagine him lower in the evolutionary timeline. Okay, so imagine that he's on all fours. So his head's up like this, right? And, dear Lord. And he has a tail. I don't know. Those are his legs. Do you see what I'm saying? He's on all fours and his head is up. Okay, so now dorsal goes this way, right? Dorsal goes this way, which means dorsal goes this way. Ventral is this way and this way. Okay, now, the way I remember this, dorsal, if you think about if our little dude on all fours had a dorsal fin, okay, and his head is in the upright position because he's on all fours, then dorsal is in this direction, right? And ventral is going to be toward the lungs. So ventral in the brain. Let's go to the next guy. Here we go. So ventral, right? This is the top of the head. And ventral is going down toward the lungs. Think of it that way. That kind of helps me straighten things out. Okay? Anterior is still toward the front, posterior is still toward the back. Okay, now let's look at what we mean by lateral view and medial view. And I will put away my pen so I don't get too carried away. Okay, so when we talk about directions and planes, when we talk about planes in the human brain, there are three kind of big ones. And these are used for brain, body, any kind of anatomy. So a sagittal cut is going to be right down the middle. Not necessarily down the middle, but the sagittal cut is going to be up and down. Okay, it's going to be a vertical cut through the body or the brain. This one is right in the middle. This is a mid-sagittal cut. Okay, and this is what it would look like, a mid-sagittal cut, if you looked at the brain from this direction, right? So you cut it and you look at it from that direction, and this is what it would look like. Now this brain is facing the opposite direction, right? This guy is facing this way, this guy is facing this way, and this is what that mid-sagittal cut would look like in a structural MRI. Coronal cut, otherwise known as a frontal, is right through the brain that way. Okay, so kind of like you put a headband on your head, right? And that is the direction that you would cut. So if you cut through the brain, here are the eyes. If you cut through the brain this way and you look at it that way, what you're going to see is something like this. Okay, so these are the ventricles here. All right. This is what you would see if you looked at that same sort of cut in a structural MRI. This is further back because you can see the cerebellum. Now, transverse planes, these are the eyes here, cut sort of right through the middle of the face in a horizontal manner, right? So if you cut it that way and you look down on the brain from that direction, this is what you're going to see. And there are those ventricles, 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 the same structure here. All right. This is the same kind of cut. It's a transverse cut or horizontal. It's also called a horizontal plane. That's what it would look like in structural MRI. All right. So that is it for directions and planes. Let's talk about the cerebral cortex. The cortex is all the wrinkly stuff, right? I've been talking about cortex already. We've been comparing the cortex of different mammalian species. What are the components of the cortex? Yes, it actually does have components that have names. So it's like a bunch of hills and valleys, right? A bunch of crinkly hills and valleys. The valleys, the little spaces, are called sulci. The big valleys, like this one here, are called fissures. This is the longitudinal fissure. And the hills, these lumps here, those are gyri. Now, cerebral cortex, we've talked about cortex sort of having this map-like representation of different areas of the body, right? So if you touch here, that maps to a particular area of the body. So this, if you imagine, I don't know if you can see that this is actually a cut of the brain. So this is a coronal cut, right? So it's though we're using, oh Lord, guys, what have I done? Okay, so this is a coronal cut that we're looking at. And this part of the cortex goes for toes, this is for ankle, this is for knee, right? So you're mapping the cortex to different parts of the body. We talked about how the size of the homunculus corresponds to the amount of cortex that's dedicated to that part of the body, right? So you've got a lot. This is the sensory strip, which is back here in parietal cortex. The motor strip is right next to it in frontal cortex. So in your sensory strip, you've got a lot of sensation coming in from the face, from the hands, from the feet. In the motor strip, you've got a lot dedicated to your hands, right? We do a lot of things with our hands, and a lot dedicated to our faces as well. So, I mean, we're not the only ones with sensory motor cortexes. Cortices. So if we do another cross-species comparisons, just to, just for interest's sake, what do you notice? So these guys have sort of a lot more sensory motor cortex per square inch of brain, if you look at it that way. So if you look at how much of this, if you just combine this into one big sensory motor cortex area, right? Look at how big this sensory motor cortex is compared to this brain, right? Comparatively speaking, we should have something like this, right? Look at this sensory motor on the rat. Okay, so the cat has to hunt. The rat has to live, survive, run away. These guys are really super duper dependent on this sensory motor integration. And it's not like we aren't, okay? But these evolutionary differences can be very interesting to look at and to speculate as to why these particular differences would exist. Is that something for you to think about? Could be a really good interaction topic. Okay. Let's have a look at a couple of subcortical structures that I think that you should kind of know about. So these are all part of the forebrain. Okay, the cortex and all of these subcortical structures are going to be part of the forebrain. Okay, this stuff back here is going to be the hindbrain, and I'll show you specifically in the next slide what the hindbrain is all about. So the first guy I want you to know about is the thalamus. This is a sensory relay center. We will talk about this in sensation and perception. Every sense goes through the thalamus. It sends its information right through there. Every sense has its own set of nuclei that it's working with in the thalamus. That is, except for smell. Okay, smell does not send its information to the thalamus. Now, the next thing to know about is the hypothalamus, literally meaning under the thalamus. This guy's taking care of a lot of your basic body needs: body temperature, hunger, thirst, sexual behavior, etc. Then there's this guy, the hippocampus. What a funny name. Why is it called a hippocampus? Because hippocampus means seahorse in Greek. And if you look at one of these hippocampus, hippocampi. If you look at a hippocampus in real life, it looks like a seahorse. And usually I pull up a picture here to show you that comparison, but I'm sure you could go on and find a picture of that yourself. Either that or I'll show you a picture of it in the memory lecture. Okay. Last but not least, we have our amygdala, literally translating to almond. Why? Because it's almond shaped. It's about the size of a lima bean, and it deals with emotional processes, all the emotions. Let's, it's all in the amygdala. So, this is especially true for emotional memories, which is no coincidence that the amygdala is buddy, proximally buddy with the hippocampus. It's very much involved in things like fear and anger and so deep emotions are really driven by the amygdala. Okay. Oh, I forgot about this guy up here. So the pituitary, this is our master gland. Okay, remember we talked about fight or flight in the nervous system, right? We talk about the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. Sympathetic gets you all revved up to go and, fight the bear and win. And the sympathetic nervous system calms you down after you have actually run away instead of fighting the bear and winning. So the pituitary gland has to do with a lot of, so it releases a bunch of hormones. The hormones affect directly affect functions of other glands. So the adrenocorticotropic hormone from the pituitary stimulates your adrenal glands that sit on top of your kidneys. The adrenal glands make adrenaline and other hormones that are used in the fight or flight response. So this was all forebrain stuff. Okay, everything that we were just talking about was forebrain. But guess what? The hindbrain is important too. In fact, the hindbrain is probably some of the most primitive brain that we have. So when we look at the hindbrain, the things we want to focus on are the cerebellum, literally translating to little brain, and it has a lot to do with fine motor skills. But we are learning a whole lot more about what the cerebellum is doing in recent studies. So stay tuned for that. And I think you actually have a reading on that at some point, if not this week. Okay. The medulla oblongata, which is the funnest name to say from the brain. It's kind of an extension of the spine. It coordinates your heart rate. It deals with circulation, respiration. It also contains the reticular formation, which deals with sleep and wakefulness and levels of arousal. Then there's the pons, and the pons relays information from the cerebellum to the rest of the brain. Okay, pons translates to bridge, I believe, and relays information from the cerebellum. So it's the communication center between the hindbrain and the forebrain. Okay, so here is the pons we were just talking about, right? There's the medulla, and there's the cerebellum. Now, if we look at the midbrain specifically, we have the tectum and the tegmentum. So the tectum is involved in proprioception. The tectum is here. Tectum is actually two different structures. And the tegmentum is here. So this is more anterior, this is more posterior. Tectum is involved in proprioception, which is about knowing where you are in your environment. We'll talk more about that in sensation and perception. And the tegmentum has to do with movement and arousal and orienting yourself toward different stimuli in your environment. Okay, so I don't have a last slide here, but I will say that this is the last slide for now. And I will see you in your next week of lectures, which I believe has to do with, it might be the mind and machine stuff. It might be the hemisphere stuff. I'll get it right. Don't worry. I'll see you then. Bye.